Hi guys, here we are. This is Mike L from the Comic Book Syndicate. We're coming to you again from Detroit Comics in Ferndale, Michigan, and we're with our pals Miles Mayhem and Jeff. Jeff doesn't have a cool name yet. We're working on it.
Boo.
Give us some time. We're talking about a comic that has partly inspired the film X-Men Apocalypse. So this is going back to 1987.
Height of the X-Men.
Yeah, this is basically the height of the X-Men's popularity. This is a crossover. Interestingly enough, the X-Men, X-Factor, and New Mutants issues do not cross over to each other. It's a theme, the Fall of the Mutants. Now, the Fall of the Mutants storyline in each book was different. The one that happened in X-Factor, we're going to talk about in a minute, but first we have to explain what X-Factor was. What had happened was the original X-Men had left the team in 1975 and gone on to do other things, like be members of the Champions and be members of the Defenders. With the launch of this book in 1986, they got all the original X-Men back together, including Jean Grey, who was dead. They basically said, oh, she wasn't dead. She was in a coma the whole time. Make a long story short. So this brought back, first thing it did was it sort of brought the character Apocalypse to the forefront of the X-Factor storyline. He'd already been introduced early on in the series, and this is the first time X-Factor really confronts him. So this is going back to my childhood. This was my introduction to X-Factor. And let me just tell you, when this thing came out, I absolutely loved it. Mm-hmm. On the cover, we see here, this is Archangel, who's now been sort of taken over by Apocalypse and become one of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He's become Death. So this obviously jumped out off the stands to me, and I picked it up and read it, and I loved it at the time it came out. So first I want to ask Miles, did you read this when it came out, or?
No. I read it probably in the mid-90s, like after I had seen like a lot of the X-Men cartoon.
Okay.
And I know they had used a lot of this for the cartoon, but I vividly remember the first issue of this series. It's basically a reintroduction to the Apocalypse character, and I loved like that it almost added a lot to his villainy that he had been around for a really long time planning this for centuries. You know?
A really long time, meaning thousands of years, because in this story, Apocalypse basically tells us that throughout history, he's gone by different names. Apocalypse tells us in this story, the ancient Egyptians called me Set. In Persia, I was Sauru. The Aztecs called me something unpronounceable. And what's interesting is he doesn't go as far to say that in the Bible, I was called Apocalypse, because that would offend Christians. But that's basically what they're implying is when they say the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, they're saying this guy. Jeff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Set, and these are gods. These are like, I mean, the myths have been about him. That's kind of amazing, right?
And who knows, maybe there's a precedent for this type of story, but I certainly know that I hadn't seen it at the time. And so then you got to give credit to Louise Simonson and Walt Simonson for basically, in this spin-off X-Men book, introducing a character that's been around longer than every other mutant, that's more powerful than Magneto or whoever else was around at the time. And this, I mean, great design. Okay, we'll forgive the big A on his belt. I mean, Galactus had a G, Apocalypse has an A. Fine. Other than that, though, a very powerful mutant that could basically change his shape, could turn into anything. He's got these weird, giant lips that connect to his ears. That's kind of a cool look, right? What do you guys think of Apocalypse overall? Miles?
From your childhood, you look at a character like that, and it makes perfect sense. You know, you look at that, and it's, you can't think too hard about it because he looks kind of silly. But as far as, like, generally, like, what a villain should look like he looks like the ultimate villain. I really feel like he has, like, a really evil presence to him.
Jeff, what do you think?
I think as a creator, I think you have a real fundamental problem. Like, what superpowers do you give a god? Right? What superpowers do you give?
What are his limits?
Yeah, what are his limits? Like, I think it's a hard thing to say. So when he says, when you see these shots of them trying to punch him, and he changes his hand into a shield, and it was like, yeah, okay.
Well, and also,
that's cool and all, but
and I don't want to spoil it, but at the end of the story, X-Factor doesn't really defeat Apocalypse. He kind of says, oh, I'm going to take off, and by the way, you can have my ship. This gigantic ship that's the size of Manhattan, he just gives it to them. Okay, let's talk about the story quick. This is a combination of a bunch of subplots that have been building over time. Apocalypse had been recruiting his horsemen throughout X-Factor's first 2 years.
The horsemen, Four Horsemen.
The Four Horsemen.
The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
Famine, pestilence, war, and death. He had the first three. He needed someone to be Death. So what had happened about a year earlier was Warren Worthington's wings were amputated because of
Angel.
an injury. Yeah, sorry, Angel's wings were amputated because of an injury he had from a battle. This was the first time we saw him as the Archangel. Now, I'm not sure if you guys were X-Men fans before you read the story, but what was your impression of Warren as the Archangel?
You know, at that age, you like seeing the new costumes. It was appealing to the eye.
As a child of the 70s and 80s, my connection to Angel prior to this wasn't like these characters didn't at that time have like the emotional charge that maybe they did have to other people, but it was badass.
Now, let's talk about the art. Walt Simonson at the time was one of the most popular artists at Marvel. He did a huge run. Yeah, he had revitalized Thor in the early 80s, and this is what he did as his follow-up to Thor. I was a huge fan of Walt Simonson at the time. I do think some of the panels are a little bit rushed. I think Walt Simonson tends to draw quickly from what I can see. If you look at page from 10 on to the end of the book, I don't know if you guys notice this. The last panel of each page follows Caliban, just Caliban, getting injured and listening to what's going on. See? And it's its own separate subplot. Thinking,
for sure.
listening, and finally at the end, he decides to join Apocalypse. We're basically given the thought process of Caliban just by him listening for like 10 pages, and at the end of the issue, he betrays X-Factor and joins Apocalypse.
To me, that's something that you can do with comics, is you can have two things occurring simultaneously.
On one page.
On one page. And you have to, like, you might read them separately. Like, you might kind of, like, read that in, like, connect. Like, you might go from here to here. But when you see the whole, you also have to constantly be, like, connecting here to here and here to here. So the ability to have two things going on at the same time is unique. I mean, I think you can kind of do that in prose. You can kind of do that in poetry, but comics, because space is so important, you could really utilize that space to create that. I mean, that's a great moment.
And that's a great point. And the thing is with prose, when you're reprinting a book, you can reprint prose any way you like. You can have it, depending on the size of the font, you can have the words occupy as many pages as you want. With a comic book, the page itself is the art form, so you can't change the layout of the page. And if you did, it would completely alter that subplot at the bottom of the pages there, right?
Absolutely.
And you also notice on this pages on the left here, Apocalypse also has his own
this
little...
is like ongoing. There's always this kind of conversation going on where he's observing the fight. So really there's the Apocalypse panels on the left, the Caliban panels on the bottom, and then the fight going on.
It's almost like a mini comic.
Yeah. There's three things going on at once. It's amazing. Let's talk about the dialogue. Okay, Louise Simonson is a great writer, but one thing I noticed as I got older and reread her stuff is their dialogue is very expository. Hey, Iceman, I heard you on TV telling the humans no mutants by their deeds. It's only fair. I'm Famine. I spare nobody. What could be fairer than that? Okay, when I read it when I was 10, 11, 13, it was perfect. Reading it as an adult now, it obviously doesn't hold up, but guess what? It was intended for teenagers. It's perfect for teenagers. Ideally, some of this, like there are parts in the story where the dialogue is explaining what's happening in the art.
Yeah, like
There's
this
no
one.
excuse for that.
Now it's our turn. Our shackles, freezing, cracking with the cold. We're free. Like, it is exactly what's happening in the art, and that's a problem with.
Unfortunately, it's the Marvel style of the day. I think all Marvel comics are like that. Do you agree?
I will say in a lot of Spider-Man comics, you're actually getting a lot of thought bubbles, which actually, when I was younger, always made more sense to me. And I did latch onto Spider-Man because of that. I'm like, oh, this guy isn't always explaining to everyone else what's going on.
Okay.
He's thinking of it, and or you're getting a little side thing where somebody above the story is explaining. You have another narrator, that's outside the story, or that is telling you this story. But in a lot of these X-Men comics, you're right. You're getting dialogue that is explaining every single thing that's going on. But that's, that was just the style then.
But to be fair, the one good thing about these comics, they did take a long time to read, and it's a lot that happened. So if you're not a fan of modern decompressed stories with 4 panels per page and 2 scenes per issue, this is a comic that has more substance to it, I think, even though the dialogue is a little bit dated.
And then the third issue is the fallout from
It's
that.
like an epilogue, yeah.
Epilogue, which it's kind of a weird issue. There's not much battle. It's really dealing with X-Factor kind of dealing with damage control and their image and the way people view mutants. And so here, like a lot of this third issue is people getting angry at them for trashing the city, or the police like questioning whether they should, like what they should do with them and how they should view them and whether they're heroes or not heroes. And then it ends with a parade, and Apocalypse is sitting there like from on high saying, I gave you my ship, it's going to corrupt you. This is a symbol of my power, it's going to give you power, but now it's going to corrupt you. And it's a really weird way of ending the story. It's weirdly anticlimactic, but they don't defeat him. Like, these were a big deal when I read them. I loved them. When I reread them now, they seem much smaller than like, I remember Apocalypse being this big deal, and yet when I reread this, what happens isn't really that big. And so while like the idea of Apocalypse is cool, Apocalypse is underwhelming in some ways.
Well, and also, to be fair, the storyline is partly ruined because of Marvel's insistence on connecting everything, where the Horsemen will be fighting and then they'll disappear, and it'll say, if you want to find out what happened to him, read Power Pack or read Captain America. And that really dulls the impact of the story when you have to read another comic you're not collecting in order to find out what happens. You know, and that's partly why I hate crossovers and I boycott them.
Yeah.
You know, and this is the beginning of crossovers, and it wasn't as bad as the ones that came later, but that does...
If you could like take the idea of Apocalypse and really like embrace it and pull out all the cool stuff, I think you could do something really, really cool with it. I just like, I mean, these were really good at the time. But rereading them, I'm not like, I don't know if I'm blown away by them.
These comics, you can still get them in Essential, X Factor, as well as the Fall of the Mutants collections. They're not masterpieces, but they are good. They are a perfect reflection of the time they were published. One of the most popular series of its day, X Factor, Fall of the Mutants. And this is partly the inspiration for the film X-Men Apocalypse. So if you get the chance, pick this up, because it does hold up. I'm sure you guys agree. To some extent, it holds up.
To some
Oh,
extent.
totally.
Some decent writing.
It doesn't feel dated.
No, it doesn't feel dated. Some decent writing, some great art. This is X Factor, Fall of the Mutants. So please check it out. Thanks a lot.